The slow magic of ancient ritual. Imagine it is the deep heart of the night in ancient Babylon. In the silent, cavernous interior of a great temple, a priest begins a ceremony. He does not shout. He does not dance. His movements are slow, deliberate, and endlessly repetitive. For the next 7 hours, he will follow a precise and unchangeable sequence of 47 specific steps, each one laid down by traditions 1,000 years old. He will wash his hands in a specially consecrated bowl of water 7 times. He will light a stick of cedarwood incense, measure out a precise quantity of grain for an offering, and begin the low, monotonous, and hours-long recitation of a prayer, its words a sacred and unchanging rhythm. This is not a performance for an audience. It is a piece of cosmic engineering. To the modern mind, this is an act of profound and almost unimaginable boredom. To the ancient mind, it was the single most important work in the world. This was the slow, methodical, and deeply tedious magic of ancient ritual. Tonight, we are not going on a journey into the dramatic, exciting, and blood-soaked ceremonies that often dominate our vision of the past. Instead, we are doing the opposite. We are embarking on a slow, quiet, and deeply methodical exploration of the boring, bureaucratic, and procedural heart of ancient ritual. We will discover that the true power of these lost ceremonies was not in their spectacular climax, but in their slow, grinding, and repetitive process. We will see how our ancestors believed that the universe was not a place of chaos, but a grand, intricate machine, a clockwork of divine forces that responded not to passionate pleas, but to the correct and patient execution of a specific technical procedure. To them, magic and religion were a form of science, and the rituals were the experiments, each step a vital line in a complex equation. Our journey will take us from the silent temples of Babylon, where we will examine the tedious 7-hour preparations for receiving a divine dream, to the humid jungles of the Mayan Empire, where we will conduct a slow, clinical analysis of the ritualistic tools and repetitive motions of royal bloodletting. We will travel to the embalming houses of ancient Egypt to witness not the high drama of a pharaoh's funeral, but the slow, chemical, and administrative process of mummification, a procedure that was part sacred rite and part industrial process. And finally, we will stand in the misty oak groves of the Celtic Druids to understand the boring, logistical calculations and calendrical precision required to perform a single, perfect ceremony at the moment of the solstice. This is a journey for those who find a strange comfort in the dust of history, and who understand that the deepest secrets of the past are often found not in the dramatic headlines, but in the quiet, patient, and deeply boring fine print. The Temple of Dreams, an introduction to Babylonian dream incubation. Imagine you are a merchant in the great, sprawling city of Babylon in the 2nd millennium before Christ. You are facing a decision of immense consequence. A new trade route has opened to the east, a journey of great risk, but even greater potential reward. Your family's entire fortune hangs in the balance. You have consulted your advisors, you have weighed the risks, you have examined the ledgers, but human counsel and rational calculation are not enough. You need something more. You need a sign, a moment of absolute clarity, a direct communication from the gods themselves. And in ancient Mesopotamia, there was a slow, methodical, and deeply tedious ritual for just such a purpose. You would prepare yourself for a process known as dream incubation. The Babylonians, and their Sumerian predecessors, believed that dreams were not the random firings of a sleeping mind, but were one of the primary methods of divine communication. A dream was a vision, a message, a diagnosis, or a prophecy sent directly from a god. But to receive a dream of such importance, you could not simply go to sleep and hope for the best. You had to make yourself a worthy vessel for the divine message. You had to embark on a slow, painstaking, and deeply boring process of ritual purification. This was not a quick affair. It was a multi-day commitment to cleansing your body and your spirit, to strip away the mundane contaminations of the world, and to turn yourself into a perfect, silent antenna ready to receive a signal from the heavens. Your journey would begin with a visit to the temple of a specific god, perhaps Shamash, the god of justice, or Ishtar, the goddess of love and power, depending on the nature of your question. Here, you would be met by a priest, a specialist in the sacred and bureaucratic arts of divine communication. Your first task would be a confession. You would have to recount all of your recent transgressions, your lies, your moments of anger, your ritual impurities. The priest would listen, his face impassive, and then he would prescribe the first tedious steps of your purification. You would be required to fast, to abstain from certain foods and from all physical pleasure. You would perform a series of ritual washings, using specially consecrated water, mixed with salt and cedar shavings. This process of cleansing would continue for several days. Each day, you would return to the temple to recite a series of long, monotonous, and deeply repetitive prayers and incantations, their words designed to slowly quiet the noisy chatter of your conscious mind and to demonstrate your humility before the gods. The priest would interpret the omens of your daily life, the flight of a bird, the shape of the smoke from the incense burner, to determine if your ritual purity was increasing. Only when all the signs were correct, when you were in a state of perfect, humble, and deeply boring ritual cleanliness, would the final stage of the process begin. You would be led, in the evening, into a special, secluded chamber within the temple complex, a sacred dormitory known as the abaton. Here, you would lie down on a simple reed mat, the air thick with the scent of cedar wood, and you would finally, after days of preparation, be allowed to sleep, in the hope that a god might find you worthy enough to speak to in the silent language of dreams. The 7-hour preparation, a tedious path to the divine bed. Having been accepted by the temple priests, your journey into the heart of the divine dream now begins in earnest. The process of becoming a worthy vessel for a god's message is not a matter of simple prayer. It is a long, slow, and deeply tedious stripping away of your worldly identity. The 7 hours of ritual preparation that precede your entry into the sacred sleeping chamber are a masterpiece of monotonous, repetitive, and deeply boring procedural magic. This is not a ceremony of high drama, but a slow, grinding, and meticulous process, a bureaucratic checklist for the soul. The ritual begins with the body. The priest leads you to a special purification chamber within the temple walls. Here, you must remove your dusty, everyday clothes, the garments that carry the scent and the spiritual residue of the marketplace and the street. You are given a simple, rough-spun linen cloth to wear. The priest then begins the first of many ritual ablutions. This is not a quick wash. He uses water drawn from a specific, sacred well within the temple grounds. Water that has been allowed to settle overnight in a clay vessel, so that all impurities have sunk to the bottom. He mixes this water with a precise measure of salt and crushed cedar shavings, two substances believed to have powerful cleansing properties. Then, with a series of low, monotonous chants, he begins to wash you, starting with your hands, then your feet, then your face. The repetitive motions and the droning of his voice designed to lull your mind into a state of calm submission. Next comes the purification of the senses. You are given a small bowl of water mixed with natron, a natural salt, and you must rinse your mouth, spitting the water into a designated basin, a physical act of expelling any lies or profane words you may have spoken. A fine, clean linen cloth is used to wipe your ears, to cleanse them of any gossip or blasphemy you may have heard. And finally, a single drop of cedar oil is placed on your eyelids to purify your sight so that you may be worthy of a divine vision. This entire process is slow, methodical, and deeply impersonal. You are not a person in this moment. You are an object being prepared, a vessel being scoured clean for a sacred purpose. With the physical purification complete, the spiritual cleansing begins. You are led to a small, bare chapel, where you must sit or kneel on a reed mat. The priest then begins the long, tedious process of the confessional litany. He will recite a long, all-encompassing list of potential sins and transgressions, from major crimes like theft and adultery to minor impurities like showing disrespect to an elder or stepping on a sacred insect. After each potential sin is named, you must respond, confessing if you are guilty. This is not a conversation. It is a monotonous call and response ritual that can go on for hours, a slow, grinding audit of your entire moral and spiritual life. Once the confession is complete, the prayers of supplication begin. You must now recite, over and over again, a series of long and deeply repetitive hymns to the God whose guidance you seek. The language is archaic, the phrasing is formulaic, and the goal is to repeat the prayer so many times that the words lose their meaning and become a pure, meditative sound, a vibration that is meant to attune your spirit to the frequency of the divine. All the while, the priest is observing not you but the world around you. He is watching the smoke from the incense burner for any unusual patterns, listening to the sound of the wind for any strange whispers, watching the behavior of a temple cat for any sign that the gods are listening. This process of divination is itself a slow, boring, and deeply uncertain affair. If an unfavorable omen is seen, the entire, multi-hour ritual of prayer and purification may have to be started again from the very beginning. Only when all the signs are deemed favorable, when the smoke rises straight and the omens are clear, can the final preparations for your divine sleep begin. A catalogue of omens, the mundane interpretation of a god's message. You awaken in the deep, pre-dawn chill of the abaton, the sacred sleeping chamber. The air is still thick with the scent of cedar wood and old stone. There is no sudden, jolting revelation, no echo of a divine voice in your ears. The dream, when it came, was not a grand, cinematic narrative. It was a strange, fragmented, and deeply mundane tapestry of images. You remember the feeling of walking through a field of barley, but the stalks were an unusual shade of blue. You recall the image of a river, not the mighty Euphrates, but a small, sluggish stream, its water thick, with a reddish-brown silt. And most vividly, you remember seeing an ox, a familiar beast of burden, but in your dream, it was patiently chewing on a single, desiccated date palm frond. These are the fragments, the raw, unprocessed data that you have brought back from the edge of the divine world. Your first, instinctual act is to speak, to try and capture the fleeting images in words before they dissolve in the morning light. But you stop yourself. The rules of the ritual are absolute. You must not speak a single word. You must not even whisper to yourself. The dream is a fragile, sacred vessel, and to speak of it to anyone other than the temple priest would be to spill its contents, to profane the divine message and render it useless. And so, you lie in the silence, replaying the strange, boring images in your mind, your heart, a mixture of hope and profound anxiety. Have the gods spoken, or have you merely had a meaningless dream brought on by days of fasting and a night spent on a hard floor? A temple acolyte arrives, a silent figure who gestures for you to follow. You are led, still in your simple linen cloth, back to the small chapel where your purification began. The priest is waiting for you. He does not ask, "Did you dream?" He simply sits, his face a mask of patient, bureaucratic neutrality, and he waits. This is not a moment for emotional outpourings. It is the beginning of a slow, methodical, and deeply tedious process of divine translation. You begin to speak, and your voice feels strange and loud in the quiet room. You recount the dream, not as a story, but as a clinical report, a list of observed phenomena. I saw a field, you say. The barley was blue. The priest makes a note on a clay tablet, his stylus moving with a slow, practiced motion. I saw a river, you continue. Its water was muddy and red. Another note is made. I saw an ox. It was eating a dried palm frond. The priest does not offer an immediate, brilliant interpretation. He does not gasp in revelation. Instead, He consults his own vast internal library of omens, a collection of knowledge passed down through generations of his order. He might even turn to a collection of actual clay tablets, a kind of ancient dream dictionary, and begin the slow, methodical process of cross-referencing your visions. This is not an act of spiritual inspiration. It is an act of scholarly research. He would look up barley, then cross-reference it with the qualifier blue. He would find the entry for river and then look for the specific meaning of reddish mud. He is not a mystic in this moment. He is a divine accountant, a bureaucrat of the soul, and he is auditing your dream. After a long period of this silent, scholarly work, he finally speaks. And his interpretation is not the grand, life-altering prophecy you might have hoped for. It is a series of small, practical, and deeply mundane pieces of advice. The blue barley, he might explain, is a sign of a potential issue with a shipment of lapis lazuli from the north. You should send a messenger to confirm its progress. The muddy red river is not a symbol of death or war, but a simple, divine warning that the spring floods may be less powerful than anticipated this year, and that you should therefore secure your grain contracts early, before the price rises. And the ox chewing the dried palm frond? That is a message concerning one of your business partners, a man whose family emblem is the palm tree. The omen suggests he is feeling undernourished by his share of your current venture. You should offer him a small, symbolic gift to ensure his continued loyalty. The message from the gods was not a grand, sweeping vision of your future. It was a series of small, practical, and deeply boring business tips. This was the reality of dream incubation, a slow, tedious, and bureaucratic process designed not to reveal your ultimate destiny, but to provide you with the small, crucial pieces of information needed to successfully navigate the quiet, mundane challenges of the coming weeks. The debt of kings, the purpose of Mayan bloodletting ceremonies. We travel now from the dry, dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the humid, suffocating density of the Central American rainforest. Imagine you are a Mayan noble in the great city-state of Yaxchilan in the 8th century AD. You are standing in the central plaza, the air thick with the smell of copal incense and the low, rhythmic chanting of priests. You are here to witness one of the most important, most sacred, and most deeply misunderstood rituals of your civilization. You are here to watch your king and queen pay a debt. This is not a debt of gold or of territory. It is a debt of blood, a sacred transaction with the gods that is not an act of cruelty, but the very foundation of your cosmic order and the single most important duty of your royal family. To the modern mind, the concept of ritual bloodletting is one of grotesque and savage barbarism. But to the classic Maya, it was a profound and necessary act of reciprocity. Their entire worldview was built on a cyclical understanding of creation and sacrifice. They believed that the gods had shed their own blood to create the world and to make human life possible. The maize from which humanity was formed, the rain that nourished it, the sun that gave it life. All of these were gifts, born from the original, divine sacrifice. The blood of mortals, therefore, and particularly the sacred, royal blood of the king and queen who were the living intermediaries between the human and divine realms, was the only worthy repayment. To shed one's own blood was not an act of self-harm. It was a cosmic duty, a way of nourishing the gods, of maintaining the delicate balance of the universe, and of ensuring that the sun would continue to rise and the rains would continue to fall. This was a responsibility that fell most heavily upon the ruler, the Kuhula Jaw, or Holy Lord. His blood was the most potent, the most valuable spiritual substance in the kingdom. The ritual of bloodletting was the central performance of his power and his piety. It was performed at every major event in the life of the city-state. The dedication of a new temple, the celebration of a military victory, the accession of a new king, or the marking of a critical date in their complex and deeply important calendar. It was a public and theatrical spectacle, but it was also a deeply personal and painful ordeal. The goal was not to die, but to suffer, to offer up the one thing that was uniquely yours, your own pain, your own life force, as a gift to the gods. This was not a bizarre, savage rite. It was the slow, methodical, and deeply boring work of keeping the universe in balance. A blade of obsidian, the slow preparation of ritual tools and attire. The great act of royal bloodletting was not a spontaneous or impulsive event. It was a carefully staged and deeply symbolic piece of religious theatre. And like any grand performance, it required an immense amount of slow, methodical, and deeply tedious preparation. The days leading up to the ceremony would have been a quiet, humming hive of activity within the royal quarters of the palace. This was a time of ritual purification, of the careful selection of sacred garments, and of the painstaking preparation of the tools that would be used to shed the royal blood. To understand the ritual, you must first understand the almost obsessive, boring attention to detail that defined its prelude. Imagine you are an attendant in the court of the Mayan king. Your first task is the preparation of the tools. These were not simple knives or needles. They were objects of immense spiritual power and artistic beauty. The most important of these were the obsidian blades. Obsidian, a black, volcanic glass, was a sacred substance to the Maya, believed to have originated from the underworld. The process of creating a ritual blade was a ritual in itself. A master flint-knapper, a man of high status and spiritual training, would take a core of obsidian and, using a deer antler or a piece of hardwood, would begin the slow, precise process of pressure flaking. With each carefully applied pressure, a long, thin, leaf-shaped blade, sharper than a modern surgical scalpel, would be split from the core. Each blade was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a sliver of petrified darkness designed to open a doorway to the gods. Other tools were also prepared. Stingray spines, imported at great cost from the distant coastal regions, were prized for their natural sharpness and their connection to the watery underworld. They would be cleaned, polished, and sometimes inscribed with tiny, almost invisible glyphs. Pieces of knotted rope, often embedded with thorns or slivers of obsidian, were also prepared, not as an instrument of torture, but as a tool for maximizing the sacred offering. The logic was simple and pragmatic. To draw a thorny rope through a wound was to ensure a greater and more continuous flow of the precious, divine substance of blood. All of these tools would be stored in intricately carved wooden or ceramic boxes and would be ritually purified in the smoke of burning copal incense for hours, even days, before the ceremony. At the same time, the royal attire was being prepared. The king and queen would not perform this sacred act in simple clothes. They would be dressed in the most elaborate and symbolically potent garments they possessed. Imagine the slow, methodical work of the royal weavers, using backstrap looms to create magnificent textiles of brightly colored cotton, woven with the patterns of gods and cosmic symbols. The selection of the specific garments for the ceremony would have been a matter of intense debate and calendrical calculation, with different outfits being appropriate for different gods or different points in the sacred calendar. The king would wear a massive, towering headdress of iridescent quetzal feathers, a symbol of his connection to the sky gods. He would be adorned with heavy jade necklaces, ear spools, and pectorals. The green stone, a symbol of fertility, of maize, and of life itself. The queen's attire would be equally magnificent. The famous lintels of Yaxchilan show the great queen, Lady Shuk, dressed in an intricate, woven robe. Her headdress, a complex assembly of symbols, her arms and neck covered in jade. This was not an act of vanity. It was a process of transformation. To put on these sacred garments was to shed one's mortal identity and to become a living embodiment of the divine, a worthy vessel for the great act of communion with the gods. The silent offering, a step-by-step account of royal bloodletting. The preparations are complete. The sacred tools have been purified. The royal bodies are adorned in their magnificent and heavy ceremonial attire, and the moment of the great transaction has finally arrived. Imagine you are that Mayan noble again, standing in the hushed, expectant crowd in the central plaza of Yaxchilan. The air is thick with the sweet, cloying smoke of burning copal incense. You are about to witness not an act of violence, but a slow, methodical, and deeply personal act of divine communion. This is a quiet, almost clinical procedure, a ritual whose power is derived not from its speed or its brutality, but from its patient, repetitive, and deeply boring precision. The ceremony begins in a small, secluded chamber, a private space away from the eyes of the common people. Here, the Queen, Lady Zook, will begin her offering. The famous and beautifully carved stone lintels from her own temple show us this intimate and painful moment in exquisite detail. She kneels on the floor, her face a mask of serene, focused piety. In her hands, she holds a large woven basket containing the tools of the ritual, the stingray spines, the obsidian blades, and a long, thick rope, studded with the cruel, backward-facing thorns of a local plant. She takes one of the sharp stingray spines and, with a slow and deliberate motion, she pierces her own tongue. This is not a quick, violent act. It is a slow, grinding process, a test of endurance and of will. Once the tongue is perforated, she threads the thorny rope through the hole, and then, with a steady, rhythmic motion, she begins to pull the entire length of the rope through the wound. Each thorn, as it passes through her tongue, tears the flesh a little more, ensuring a steady, continuous flow of the sacred, royal blood. The blood drips down from the rope into a ceramic bowl placed on the floor before her, a bowl that is filled with strips of a native paper, made from the bark of the fig tree. For the Maya, this was not an act of self-mutilation, it was an act of creation. The Queen, through her own suffering, was feeding the gods, repaying the blood debt, and ensuring the continued survival of her people. While the Queen performs her private offering, the King, Itsamnaj Bialam II, prepares for his own, more public, part of the ritual. He, too, will perforate a part of his own body, often his earlobes or another sensitive area, in a similar act of personal sacrifice. But his primary role is to take the blood that his wife has offered and to complete the transaction with the gods. He takes the ceramic bowl, now filled with the blood-soaked paper, and he carries it out into the public plaza. Here, in front of you and the assembled nobility, he places the bowl on a small stone altar and, using a sacred fire, he ignites the paper. As the blood-soaked paper burns, a thick, dark column of smoke begins to rise into the sky, and it is here that the final, magical act of the ritual takes place. The Maya believed that this smoke, the physical essence of the Queen's blood offering being transformed by fire, created a conduit, a doorway between the human and the supernatural worlds. And as you, the noble witness, stare into the swirling dark smoke, a vision is meant to appear. The lintels depict this moment with a chilling clarity. From the smoke, the head of a great divine vision serpent emerges, its mouth wide open, and from the mouth of this serpent, a deified ancestor, or perhaps the war god himself, appears, ready to communicate with the king, to offer his divine guidance, and to accept the blood debt that has now been paid in full. The boring, methodical, and deeply painful ritual is complete. The cosmos has been balanced, the gods have been nourished, and the kingdom, for now, is safe. A vision in the smoke, the spiritual and political aftermath. The blood has been shed, the sacred paper has been burned, and the vision in the smoke has been witnessed. But the ritual is not over. What followed the dramatic climax of the ceremony was a long, slow, and deeply important period of spiritual and political consolidation. The vision was not just a personal experience for the king, it was a public proclamation of his divine mandate, and the aftermath of the ritual was a carefully managed and deeply boring process of interpreting, disseminating, and solidifying the power that had been generated by the act of sacrifice. Imagine you are the king, Itsamnaj Bialam II. In the moments after the ceremony, you are exhausted, you are in pain from your own bloodletting, and you are in a heightened, trance-like state, a result of the blood loss, the intense sensory experience of the ritual, and perhaps the use of ritual psychotropics. The vision you saw in the smoke, the face of a god or an ancestor, was a powerful and deeply personal communication. But it was also a piece of vital political intelligence. Your first and most important task is to translate this private, mystical experience into a public, political narrative. You would withdraw with your highest-ranking priests and scribes into a secluded chamber. Here, the slow and methodical process of interpretation would begin. The priest, a specialist in the language of the gods, would help you to decode the specific symbols and messages of your vision. This was not a quick conversation. It was a long, tedious process of cross-referencing your vision with the sacred texts, with the calendrical position of the day, and with the specific political needs of the kingdom. Was the ancestor who appeared offering a blessing for a coming war? Was the god who spoke promising a bountiful harvest? The interpretation had to be both spiritually correct and politically useful. Once the official interpretation was decided, the work of the scribes would begin. They would be tasked with creating the permanent, public record of the event. This was the work of the great stone carvers. The famous lintels of Yaxchilan are the direct result of this process. These magnificent, intricately carved stone reliefs, placed above the doorways of the most important temples, are not just works of art. They are press releases. They are the official, state-sanctioned account of the successful ritual. A permanent and public declaration that the king and queen have fulfilled their sacred duty, that they have successfully communicated with the gods, and that their reign is therefore legitimate and divinely favored. The creation of these lintels was a slow, painstaking, and deeply boring process, involving hundreds of hours of a master carver chipping away at the stone with simple tools to create a perfect and unchanging record of the sacred moment. The aftermath of the bloodletting, then, was as important as the act itself. It was a slow, deliberate, and deeply bureaucratic process of transforming a moment of intense, personal, spiritual experience into a permanent and powerful piece of political propaganda. The House of Beauty, the administrative start of Egyptian mummification. We travel now to the banks of the Nile, to ancient Thebes, in the age of the New Kingdom. A great pharaoh has died. His last breath, the final exhalation of the living God, has set in motion not a period of chaotic grief, but the beginning of a highly organized, deeply sacred, and profoundly boring industrial process. The goal is not just to bury a king, but to transform a fragile, mortal body of flesh into an eternal, divine vessel, a perfect and unchanging house for the soul that would last for millions of years. This was the science and the art of mummification, and it began not with a grand ceremony, but with a quiet, administrative act. Imagine you are a priest in the service of the dead. The body of the pharaoh has been brought by a solemn procession to a special workshop, a place on the west bank of the Nile known as the Pernafur, the House of Beauty. This is the clean, sacred space where the great transformation will begin. Your first task is not a spiritual one. It is a bureaucratic one. You are a record keeper. With a reed pen and a sheet of papyrus, you must create a meticulous and detailed inventory. You note the date and the time of the body's arrival. You record the name of the king, his full royal titulary, and then you begin to catalogue the body itself, noting its general condition, any visible marks or scars, a process akin to a modern coroner's initial examination. This initial administrative phase was crucial. The process of mummification was not just a religious rite. It was also a massive and incredibly expensive state-funded project, and it required a level of logistical organization that would rival a small military campaign. Scribes would begin to dispatch orders. A message would be sent to the salt flats of the Wadi Natron, hundreds of miles to the north, to procure the hundreds of pounds of natron, the sacred, dehydrating salt that would be needed for the desiccation process. Another order would go out to the temples for the vast quantities of linen, some of it of the finest royal quality, that would be required for the wrapping. Messengers would be sent to the far south, to Nubia, for the precious resins like myrrh and frankincense that would be used to anoint the body. While these vast supply chains were being activated, the chief embalmer, A high-ranking priest who held the title of the overseer of the mysteries would begin his own slow and methodical preparations. He would consult the sacred texts, the secret embalming manuals that contained the precise, unchangeable recipes and incantations for the process. The ritual was a science, a divine chemistry, and every single step had to be performed in the correct order, with the correct ingredients, and at the correct time. The priests would begin the long, monotonous recitation of the first protective spells, their droning voices creating a sacred, sonic barrier around the workshop to protect the royal body from the invisible forces of chaos and decay that had already begun their assault. This was the quiet, bureaucratic, and deeply boring beginning of the great journey, a series of lists, of orders, of logistical calculations, and of quiet, repetitive prayers, all designed to set the stage for the most important technological and spiritual process in the ancient Egyptian world, the science of eternity, a clinical breakdown of the embalming process. The administrative preparations are complete, the sacred space is consecrated, and the long, slow, and deeply clinical process of transforming the pharaoh from a man into a god can now begin. This is not a ceremony of high emotion. It is a quiet, methodical, and deeply practical surgical procedure, a science of eternity performed with a reverence that is almost indistinguishable from a modern, clinical detachment. The priests of the Penefa were not just spiritual guides. They were master, anatomists, chemists, and surgeons. Imagine you are one of these priests. Your first task is to deal with the most corruptible, and therefore the most spiritually dangerous, part of the human body, the brain. The brain was considered by the Egyptians to be a useless, insignificant organ, the source of mucus, and it had to be removed. To do this, a long bronze hook, a specialized surgical instrument, would be inserted through the nostril, and the ethmoid bone, a thin, fragile plate at the base of the skull, would be carefully broken. The hook would then be used to slowly, methodically, and gruesomely liquefy the brain tissue, which would then be drained out through the nose. It was a delicate, precise, and deeply unpleasant procedure, performed with a practiced, almost bored efficiency. Next came the evisceration. A special priest, the slasher, would make a long, deep incision in the left side of the abdomen with a sacred, ritually sharpened, obsidian knife. Through this single incision, the embalmers would reach in and remove the internal organs, the stomach, the intestines, the liver, and the lungs. These organs, which would decay rapidly, could not be left in the body. The heart, however, the seat of the intelligence and the soul, was almost always left in place, as it would be needed for the final judgment in the afterlife. The empty body cavity would then be thoroughly washed and sterilized with palm wine, which acted as a natural antiseptic. The removed organs were not discarded. They were themselves considered sacred and were preserved separately. Each organ would be washed, dried in natron, and then placed into its own special, lidded container, known as a canopic jar. There were always 4 of these jars, each one protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus. The stomach was protected by the jackal-headed Duamutef, the intestines by the falcon-headed Kebesenuef, the lungs by the baboon-headed Hapi, and the liver by the human-headed Imseti. These jars would be buried with the pharaoh, a kind of divine spare parts kit for his eternal body. With the body now empty and clean, the most important and most boring part of the entire process could begin, the slow, patient science of desiccation. The body cavity would be packed with temporary bundles of natron, and the entire body would then be completely buried under a great, dry mountain of this natural, dehydrating salt. And there it would lie, for 40 long, slow, and uneventful days, as the salt slowly and inexorably pulled every last drop of moisture from its tissues, arresting the process of decay, and turning the soft, corruptible flesh into a hard, dry, and eternal vessel. 1,000 yards of linen, the methodical and repetitive art of wrapping. After 40 long and silent days, the body of the pharaoh has been transformed. The great dry mountain of natron has done its work, pulling every last drop of moisture from the tissues. The king is now a desiccated, shrunken, and almost unrecognizable figure, a hard, leathery, and eternal vessel. The temporary natron packets are removed from the body cavity, which is then washed and packed with clean linen, sawdust, and fragrant, sacred resins like myrrh to restore its shape. The great work of preservation is complete. But the work of protection has only just begun. What follows now is the final, and most tedious, of all the mummification rituals, a slow, methodical, and deeply repetitive process that will consume hundreds of yards of linen and take 15 long, monotonous days to complete. This is the art of wrapping. Imagine you are a priest, a master of this sacred craft. You are not just a wrapper, you are a weaver of magical armor, a creator of a protective textile cocoon. The process begins with the anointing. The entire body of the king is covered in a thick, fragrant layer of sacred oils and resins, a sticky, protective varnish, designed to seal the skin from the air and provide a final layer of magical and chemical protection. Then, the wrapping begins. This is not a simple, single process. It is a complex, multi-layered ritual, and each layer has its own specific type of linen and its own set of magical spells. The first stage is the wrapping of the individual digits. Each finger, each toe, is painstakingly, methodically, wrapped in fine, narrow strips of the highest quality linen. This is a slow, deeply boring, and almost meditative process that can take a full day to complete. As each finger is wrapped, a priest, the lector priest, reads from a papyrus scroll, reciting the specific, ancient, and unchangeable incantations that will magically protect that part of the body. Next, come the limbs. The arms and legs are wrapped separately, each one cocooned in multiple layers of linen. Between these layers, the priests will place a series of powerful, magical amulets, each one in a specific, ritually prescribed location. A scarab beetle amulet, the symbol of rebirth, is placed over the heart. A jade pillar, the symbol of stability, is placed on the throat. An ankh, the symbol of life, is held in the mummy's hand. Dozens of these amulets, made of gold, faience, and precious stones, are incorporated into the wrappings, creating a full, internal suit of magical armor for the king's soul. Once the individual limbs are wrapped, the process of unifying the body begins. Great, wide sheets of linen are used to wrap the entire body, from head to toe, creating the classic, iconic, mummy shape. Layer after monotonous layer is applied, each one painted with more liquid resin to act as a kind of sacred glue, hardening the wrappings into a solid, shell-like carapace. The lector priest continues his endless, droning recitation, his voice the constant, hypnotic soundtrack to this slow and repetitive work. Finally, a large, painted shroud, often depicting the god Osiris, is placed over the fully wrapped body. A final, intricate series of linen bandages is then applied, creating a beautiful herringbone pattern, holding the shroud in place. The king is now complete. He is a perfect, sealed, and divinely protected object, an eternal statue of himself, encased in 1,000 yards of linen and 100 layers of magic. The opening of the mouth, the final, tedious ceremony. The 70-day-long industrial and scientific process of creating the eternal vessel is finally complete. The body of the king is now a perfect, silent, and magically protected object. But in its current state, it is useless. It is a statue, a house with no doors or windows. For the pharaoh's soul, his ka and his ba, to be able to use this body in the afterlife, to be able to see, to speak, to eat, and to breathe in the field of reeds, one final, crucial, and deeply tedious ceremony must be performed. This is the opening of the mouth ceremony, the last and most important ritual in the entire funerary process. It is a long, slow, and highly repetitive piece of magical theatre designed to reanimate the senses of the dead king. Imagine the scene. It is the day of the funeral. The magnificent nested coffins, now containing the wrapped mummy, have been placed on a funerary sled and dragged by a team of oxen to the entrance of the newly completed tomb. Here, the coffin is stood upright, facing the assembled priests and the grieving royal family. The chief lector priest, the master of ceremonies, takes his place before the coffin. The air is thick with the smoke of incense and the low, droning chant of the other priests. The final ritual begins. The ceremony is a long and highly scripted play, with the priests taking on the roles of different gods. The central act involves a series of ritual implements, each one designed to magically open a specific sense. The lector priest first takes a special, adze-shaped instrument, often made from meteoric iron, a metal believed to have come from the heavens. With a slow, deliberate, and theatrical motion, he touches this instrument to the mouth of the coffin's golden mask. As he does so, he recites the first, powerful incantation. "I open your mouth for you." This is not a symbolic act. To the Egyptians, this was a real, magical transference of power. The king could now speak the names of the gods and the words of power he would need to navigate the underworld. This process is then repeated, over and over again, with a tedious and methodical slowness. The priest will take a different instrument and touch it to the eyes of the mask, reciting the spell that will allow the king to see the path through the darkness. He will touch the ears, to allow the king to hear the sacred incantations. He will touch the nose, to allow the king to breathe the divine air of the afterlife. The ceremony can go on for hours, a long, repetitive litany of spells and ritual gestures. It also involves a series of offerings. The priests will present the now reanimated mummy with food and drink, cuts of meat, loaves of bread, jars of beer and wine, symbolically nourishing the body for its long journey. The final act of the ceremony is the presentation of the heart. A special amulet in the shape of the heart is touched to the mummy's chest, a final, magical reminder that his own heart, the seat of his intelligence, is with him and will speak truthfully for him at the final judgment. With the last spell spoken, with the last ritual touch performed, the king is now fully equipped for eternity. The long, boring, and essential work of the living is done. The doors to the tomb can now be sealed, and the king's own personal journey can finally begin. The Forest Cathedral, an introduction to Celtic Druid ceremonies. We leave now the sun-scorched, stone-built world of the Egyptian necropolis and travel north to the cool, damp, and misty forests of ancient Gaul and Britain. Here, another lost civilization, the Celts, also practiced a profound and complex set of religious rituals, but they did not build great stone temples to their gods. Their cathedrals were not made by human hands. They were the ancient, sacred groves of the forest, the silent, towering oak trees that were, to them, the pillars of the world, a direct and living connection between the earth and the heavens. And the high priests of this forest religion, the guardians of its secrets, were the enigmatic and deeply misunderstood figures known as the Druids. To the Romans who would eventually conquer them, the Druids were a subject of both fear and fascination. Roman writers like Julius Caesar and Tacitus described them as a powerful, secretive, and highly educated priestly class who were not just religious leaders, but also judges, teachers, philosophers, and scientists. They were the intellectual glue that held the disparate Celtic tribes together. Their training, Caesar tells us, was a long and deeply tedious process that could take up to 20 years. It was an entirely oral tradition. The Druids possessed a vast store of sacred verses, of legal precedents, of historical lore, and of astronomical knowledge, all of which had to be memorized perfectly, never to be written down. Writing, they believed, weakened the memory and allowed sacred knowledge to fall into the wrong hands. Their rituals, therefore, were as ephemeral as the spoken word and the changing of the seasons. They left behind no great temples, no sacred texts. Our knowledge of their ceremonies comes from the hostile and often biased accounts of their Roman conquerors, and from the later, Christianized myths of Ireland and Wales, which preserve a faint, distorted echo of their pre-Roman past. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of a religion that was deeply tied to the natural world. Their gods were not distant, celestial beings. They were immanent, present in the rustle of the oak leaves, the flow of a sacred spring, and the turning of the stars. And so, their most important ceremonies were not conducted indoors, but under the open sky, in sacred clearings, in the forest known as nemetons. These were their cathedrals, and their most important rituals were tied to the slow, methodical, and deeply boring clockwork of the cosmos, the solstices and the equinoxes, the great turning points of the solar year. To be a druid was to be a master of this cosmic time, to understand the precise moment when the veil between the human and the divine world was at its thinnest, and to know the correct, slow, and unchangeable rituals that had to be performed at that exact moment to ensure the continued prosperity of the tribe and the balance of the world. The unchanging clock, the boring logistics of calculating the solstice. The power of the Druids lay not in dramatic miracles, but in their profound and intimate knowledge of the rhythms of the natural world. They were, first and foremost, masters of the calendar, astronomers whose primary and most sacred duty was to track the slow, repetitive, and deeply boring movement of the sun across the sky. To know the exact day of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, or the summer solstice, the longest, was to know the moment of the sun's symbolic death and rebirth. And to be able to predict this moment with absolute precision was to hold the very keys to the cosmic order. This was not a matter of guesswork. It was a science, a slow, patient, and multi-generational process of methodical observation. Imagine you are a young druid in training. Your first and most important lesson is not in magic, but in the simple, tedious art of watching. You would be taken to one of the great megalithic monuments that dotted the landscape. Ancient stone circles like Stonehenge or Newgrange that had been built by your ancestors centuries, or even millennia, before. These were not just temples. They were vast, open-air, astronomical observatories, unchanging clocks of stone. Your teacher would show you how, on the morning of the winter solstice, and only on that morning, the first rays of the rising sun would shine through a specific gap in the great standing stones, sending a single, golden beam of light down a long, stone-lined passage to illuminate a sacred chamber deep within a burial mound. Your job, for year after tedious year, would be to observe this event, to mark its coming, and to learn the subtle variations in the sun's position. But your tools were not just these ancient monumental calendars. You would also learn to read the landscape itself. You would learn how to mark the position of a prominent notch in a distant mountain range, and how to observe the exact point on that horizon where the sun would rise each day. You would spend endless, boring hours tracking this slow, seasonal journey of the sun back and forth along the horizon, a celestial pendulum swinging between its two great solstitial standstills. This was a science of immense patience. To confirm your calculations, to build a calendar that was accurate over decades and centuries, you had to rely not just on your own observations, but on the vast, orally transmitted library of observations made by the generations of druids who had come before you. The training was a slow, grinding process of memorization, of learning the thousands of sacred verses that encoded this astronomical knowledge, the verses that told of the sun's journey, the moon's phases, and the movements of the stars. This was the true, boring foundation of the Druids' power. Not a mystical connection to nature, but a deeply scientific and methodical understanding of its predictable, repetitive, and unchanging cycles. The golden sickle, a slow account of preparing sacred offerings, with the cosmic clock having been meticulously observed, and the sacred moment of the solstice finally at hand, the next phase of the ritual would begin. This was the slow, methodical, and deeply boring process of preparing the sacred offerings. A druidic ceremony was a transaction, a gift-giving between the human and the divine worlds. And for the gift to be accepted, every single element had to be perfect, pure, and prepared according to a precise and unchangeable set of rules. This was not a time for creative expression. It was a time for absolute, ritualistic conformity. The most famous of these rituals, described in a single, vivid passage by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, was the gathering of the mistletoe. This was a plant of immense spiritual power, a strange, parasitic evergreen that grew high in the branches of the sacred oak tree. It was a plant that was not of the earth, nor of the sky, a liminal being that was believed to hold the very life force of the great oak during the dead of winter. To harvest it was an act of great magical and symbolic importance. According to Pliny, the ritual had to take place on the 6th day of the new moon. A druid, dressed in a pure white robe, would climb the sacred oak tree. He would carry with him no ordinary tool, but a magnificent golden sickle. This was not a practical, iron tool for farming. It was a sacred instrument, its precious metal, a symbol of the sun and the heavens. With this golden sickle, he would carefully cut the mistletoe from the branch, ensuring that it did not touch the ground. Below, other priests would be waiting, holding out a pure white cloak to catch the sacred plant as it fell. The mistletoe, having never touched the profane earth, would then be taken to the sacred grove to become the centerpiece of the solstitial ceremony. Alongside this central dramatic offering, a host of other, more mundane preparations would be underway. The ceremony often required an animal sacrifice, typically of 2 white bulls that had never before been yoked. The selection of these animals would have been a long and tedious process, with priests examining dozens of herds to find 2 perfect, unblemished specimens. On the day of the ceremony, these bulls would be led in a solemn procession to the sacred grove. Other, smaller offerings would also be prepared: libations of milk and honey, cakes of specially prepared grain, and perhaps the ritual deposition of a valuable metal object, a beautiful bronze sword or a golden torque, which would be deliberately broken or bent to kill it, releasing its spirit as a gift to the gods before it was placed in a sacred pool or buried in the earth. Every step of this process was slow, methodical, and governed by 1,000 tiny, unwritten rules, a testament to a culture that believed that the gods did not appreciate grand, emotional gestures, but were moved only by the quiet, patient, and deeply boring perfection of a ritual correctly performed. A prayer to the oak, the quiet ritual at the heart of the forest. The sun has reached its solstice. It stands still in the sky. The sacred offerings have been meticulously prepared. And now, at the heart of the forest cathedral, in the quiet, dappled light of the Nemeton, the sacred grove, the final, culminating ritual can begin. Imagine you are a member of the tribe, allowed to witness this most holy of ceremonies from the edge of the clearing. This is not a moment of loud, ecstatic celebration. It is a moment of profound and almost silent reverence. A quiet, intimate, and deeply boring conversation between the priest and the gods. A ritual whose power lies not in its spectacle, but in its stillness. The ceremony begins with the sacrifice of the 2 white bulls. This is not a brutal, chaotic slaughter. It is a swift, precise, and solemn act. The animals are killed, and their bodies are offered up to the gods. The druid, acting as the intermediary, would then read the will of the gods in the patterns of the blood and the twitching of the limbs, a form of divination known as augury. This was the first direct communication from the divine realm, a sign of whether the great offering that was to follow would be accepted. Then comes the central act. The chief druid, the man who had cut the mistletoe with the golden sickle, would take his place at the foot of the great, ancient oak tree that was the spiritual heart of the grove. The mistletoe, the life force of the tree, would be prepared. It was likely mixed with water to create a sacred potion, a magical elixir that was believed to cure infertility and act as an antidote to all poisons. Small portions of this sacred liquid would be distributed among the people, a physical act of partaking in the divine life force of the sacred tree. And then would come the prayers. For a culture that had no written language, the spoken word was everything. The power of a druid was the power of his memory, his ability to recite, with perfect, word-for-word accuracy, the thousands of sacred verses that had been passed down through generations. And so, for what may have been hours, the grove would be filled with the low, monotonous, and deeply hypnotic sound of the druids chanting. He would be reciting the great creation myths, the genealogies of the gods and the tribe's heroic ancestors, and the specific, ancient, and unchangeable incantations that were appropriate for this sacred day. This was not a sermon, it was a magical act, the weaving of a sonic tapestry that was believed to maintain the order of the cosmos. The final part of the ritual would be the offering of the broken, killed treasures, which would be silently placed into a sacred spring or a pit dug at the foot of the oak. Their burial, a final, quiet gift to the gods of the underworld. The ritual was not a celebration of nature, but a work with nature, a slow, methodical, and deeply boring process of ensuring that the great cosmic clock would continue to tick, that the sun would reverse its course, and that the light and life would return to the world. The enduring power of methodical belief. And so, we emerge from the misty groves of the Celtic druids, from the blood-soaked plazas of the Maya, from the silent embalming houses of Egypt, and from the dark, dream-haunted temples of Babylon. We have walked the slow, methodical, and often deeply boring path of ancient ritual, and we have been met not with the high drama of Hollywood fantasy, but with the quiet, patient, and deeply bureaucratic reality of methodical belief. What, then, is the final secret that these strange, repetitive, and time-consuming ceremonies have to tell us? The story of these rituals is the story of a fundamentally different relationship with the universe. To the modern mind, the world is a largely inert and random place, a stage upon which we act out our own human dramas. To the ancient mind, the universe was a living, conscious, and often deeply dangerous organism, a great, intricate clockwork of divine forces that had to be constantly maintained, placated, and negotiated with. And these rituals were not just pleas for favor. They were the essential, technical maintenance procedures for that cosmic machine. The monotonous, 7-hour preparation for a Babylonian dream was not a waste of time. It was the necessary and tedious process of calibrating a delicate instrument, the human soul, to receive a divine signal. The painful, clinical precision of a Mayan bloodletting was not a savage act of cruelty. It was the deeply boring but vital work of repaying a cosmic debt, of watering the roots of the universe with the only currency that mattered. The slow, repetitive, and almost industrial process of Egyptian mummification was not a ghoulish obsession with death, but a sophisticated, scientific, and deeply tedious act of engineering, the construction of a divine vessel designed to last for an eternity. And the patient, calendrical calculations of the Celtic druids were not primitive superstition. They were the essential, boring work of ensuring that the great, cyclical engine of the seasons would not break down. The enduring power of these rituals lay not in their passion, but in their precision. They were a testament to the belief that the gods were not moved by emotional outpourings, but by the quiet, humble, and deeply boring perfection of a procedure correctly and patiently followed. The relink hack, from sacred rituals to a cursed tomb. But the slow, methodical magic of these ancient rituals was not always used for creation and preservation. Sometimes, the same deep belief in the power of procedure was turned to a darker purpose, the creation of a perfect, eternal curse. In 1974, Chinese archaeologists unearthed the magnificent 2,000-year-old tomb of the first emperor of China, guarded by its famous terracotta army. But the emperor's central tomb remains sealed to this day, protected not just by its immense scale, but by the ancient historian Sima Qian's terrifying and deeply methodical description of its defenses, a series of automated crossbows set to fire at any intruder, and a great flowing river of liquid mercury, designed to create a toxic and eternal barrier.